Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum. This will be lecture 19 on unemployment. So first we'll talk about how unemployment is measured. Therefore, what exactly it is that we mean, or what a government means when they talk about unemployment and an unemployment rate. And then we'll talk a bit about where unemployment comes from, why unemployment has the rate that it does, why some people are unemployed, and under what conditions that rate might go down, that rate might go up. In the United States, as in many other countries, there's a specific bureau of the government whose job it is to specifically gather information about the labor market. In the United States, that's called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS. And what they do in order to determine how many people are employed, what percentage of people are employed, what percentage of different groups of people are employed, is to survey some subset of the population of the United States regularly, typically 60,000 households, surveyed regularly, and they keep asking people a simple question: do you have a job? And that has a follow-up question: are you looking for a job? Which someone need only answer if they answer that no, I don't have one. And the people who are surveyed in this regular household survey, 60,000 households, include only adults over the age of 16. That is, if someone responds to that survey, that first, I'm 13 years old, no, I don't have a job, that wouldn't be counted for these labor statistics, because that person under the age of 16 wouldn't naturally be expected to be involved in the labor market. Now, that survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses divides people ultimately into three different categories. The first category is employed. These are people who respond, yes, I have a job. The second category is unemployed. These are people who answer that I don't have a job, but I am looking for a job. I would like a job. And the third category is people who responded, I don't have a job, but I don't want a job. I'm not looking for a job. And the name for that category is not in the labor force. There could be a variety of reasons that people might not be in the labor force, but anyone who's not in the labor force is not considered to be unemployed. The labor force is considered to be including only those people who have jobs or want jobs although they don't have them. And that calculation, the size of the labor force, assumes that people who say they don't want jobs won't be taking jobs no matter what else happens in the labor market. They aren't part of this potential pool of available labor that businesses could hire, the labor force. Now, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates an unemployment rate, they take that number of people who say that they are unemployed in that category. So they don't have a job, but they are looking for a job. And they divide that by the total size of the labor force. That's unemployed plus employed. And people who are not in the labor force don't factor into that unemployment calculation at all. Our labor force participation rate, that would be labor force participation rate, unemployed plus employed, the total size of the labor force, divided by the total population, which would be unemployed plus employed plus those people who responded that they didn't have and didn't want jobs, were not in the labor force. Now, in the United States, labor force participation rate has generally been about 70%. The unemployment rate has tended to be around 5, 6, 7%. So there are far more people who are not looking for work, therefore not participating in the labor market, than there are who are unable to find jobs even though they say that they would like them, and therefore are classified as unemployed. Now, based on the data that you see here, which comes from a snapshot of United States labor statistics in the month of September of 2013. Remember, these surveys are conducted regularly, usually monthly. They survey the same households. They find that the number of employed people in the United States as of September 2013 was estimated to be 144.3 million. Again, estimated based on a survey of 60,000 people. They didn't survey all 300 million plus people in the United States. The number of unemployed people in the United States as of September 2013 was estimated at 11.3 million, and the number of people who were not in the labor force, so didn't have jobs but said they weren't looking for jobs, was estimated at 90.6 million. We can use that data to calculate a total size of the labor force of the United States as of 2013, September 2013, as 144.3 plus 11.3. That's employed people plus unemployed people. Was the total size of the labor force, the pool of labor that should be available to businesses to potentially hire. And that would have been 155.6 million. The unemployment rate, therefore, would have been that 11.3, the total unemployed population, divided by 155.6, the total size of the labor force. And as of September 2013, that would have been 7.3%. The most recent data shows that at about 3.5%. So this unemployment rate of 7.3% is a snapshot from 2013, September 2013. That unemployment rate isn't constant over time. Next, we could calculate the total estimated size of the population, and here this is the adult population. The population at least 16 years of age, since this Bureau of Labor Statistics survey doesn't count children under the age of 16. 8-year-olds wouldn't logically be working, therefore we wouldn't consider them to be active or inactive participants in the labor market. The total adult population would be 155.6, the labor force, plus 90.6, those estimated to be not participating in the labor force, for a total of 246.2 million people. Now, if the labor force is 155.6 and the adult population is 246.2, the labor force participation rate would be 155.6 divided by 246.2, for a total of 63.2% as of September 2013. In the United States, in these surveys, the Bureau of Labor Statistics asks the same simple question: do you have a job? Are you looking for a job? Again and again and again to the same household. But they also gather other information about these individuals and households which isn't directly relevant to their employment experiences. This is demographic data. The demographic data that they gather, for example, what the race is, what the age is, what the gender is, what the educational attainment is for these various people in the survey, is used to split up these pools from the labor force, total number of employed, unemployed, not participating in the labor force, population, to see how employment opportunities and employment experiences differ for different demographic groups, for older versus younger Americans, or for women versus men, or for black versus white Americans. And what we can see is that labor market experiences do differ substantially in the United States by gender and by race. Again, looking at data specifically from September 2013, here focusing on adults over the age of 20 as opposed to 16, because adults between 16 and 20 are less likely to work, more likely to be in education. So we'll focus specifically on those over the age of 20. We see that white males and white females in the United States had unemployment rates around 6%, 6.1 and 5.5% respectively, much lower than the unemployment rates for black men and black women in the United States at 14 and 10% respectively. We can also see there that the labor force participation rate, although the unemployment rates here in this specific month are actually lower for women than they are for men, labor force participation rates are typically much lower for women than they are for men. Here, 58% for white women, as opposed to 72.6% as opposed to white men. And this is, of course, because many married women with children do not work and instead stay home to take care of those children, rather than working outside the home and paying someone else to take care of them. What we can also see is that for teenagers, those individuals who might otherwise be in education rather than involved in the labor market in any way, we see much higher unemployment rates for both Black and white Americans, and we see much lower labor force participation rates than we do for adult Americans. Of course, not all Americans are either white or Black. We could look at labor force outcomes, labor market outcomes for those who are of Asian descent or Hispanic descent. We find that unemployment rates and labor force participation rates for Asians in the United States are very similar to those for white Americans. And we find that unemployment rates and labor force participation rates for Hispanic Americans are somewhere in between Black and white, coming a bit closer to experiences for Black Americans. Next, the demographic information that's gathered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't just focus on race, age, gender, also asks questions about educational attainment. Educational attainment here being whether or not an individual went to high school, graduated from high school, went to college or university, graduated from that university, or has an advanced degree like a master's or PhD. And what we find when we break down the labor statistics by these educational categories are that adults in the United States that have less than a high school diploma, so they did not finish high school, have the highest unemployment rates and also the lowest labor force participation rates. And we see that for demographic groups with higher levels of educational attainment, as they go from no high school diploma to a high school diploma to some college to a finished university degree, we see the labor force participation rate rising, 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 and rising. So it isn't just that people with a university degree are more likely to be able to find jobs if they want them. They also seem to be more likely to want a job than those people who have lower levels of educational attainment. Why might that be? Well, for one thing, those Americans and individuals all around the world who are older, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they tend to have lower levels of educational attainment than younger people do in the United States and in Turkey and elsewhere in the world, because over time, average rates of educational attainment have risen. So those without high school degrees are disproportionately likely to be old, therefore disproportionately likely to be retired, and therefore not participating in the labor market. You can also see a plot here for the United States data, labor force data from 1950 up to 2012, 2013, comparing labor force participation rates for women on the pink or red line and men on the blue line. You can see is that in 1950 there's a very large gap between labor force participation rates for men and labor force participation rates for women. Labor force participation rate for men was around 85% in the United States as of 1950. Remember, this is for the adult population specifically. Labor force participation rate for women in 1950 was only around 35%. Now, due to cultural changes over time, we've seen that labor force participation rate for women in the United States, as in many other countries around the world, steadily rise up to about 60%, which is where it was in the 1980s and where it remains today. Note that we've also seen the labor force participation rate fall a bit for women since it peaked there. And we've seen the labor force participation rate for men steadily declining since 1950. Why would that be the case? Well, it isn't so much because the economy has been weak in the United States or demand for labor has been weak. It's because the economy in the United States or the labor force in the United States is aging. And in 1950, a relatively smaller percentage of the population in the United States was elderly and therefore retired. And over time, the percentage of the labor force, the percentage of the potential labor force of the population, the working age population, which is over 65 or likely to be retired, has been increasing and increasing and increasing. It will likely continue to increase in the future. So we should expect these labor force participation rates for both men and women to have a tendency to decline in the future in the United States and other countries as well. The next thing we want to mention is that unemployment rate, which is quite a simple calculation, calculated by asking that very simple question, do you have a job, do you want one, misses some important information about labor market outcomes. It doesn't tell us everything that we would want to know about how easy it is for people to find jobs, what kind of jobs they're able to find, etc. So suppose we look at the first scenario here, in which our individual named Sue loses a job and immediately begins to look for a new job. What happens to our unemployment rate? Well, that's the simple case that we're intending to capture. If Sue loses her job, immediately begins to look for a new job, then she is no longer employed, she is now unemployed. She remains in the labor force, so our labor force participation rate doesn't change, but our unemployment rate, the unemployed population percentage of total labor force, the unemployment rate rises. That's what our unemployment rate that we're calculating based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data is intended to capture. Now suppose in the second scenario, we have another person, John, who has also lost his job, but he didn't just lose his job. He lost his job last year as a result of the closure of his factory, his mill. And he now becomes, after looking for a job for a year, he becomes what we call discouraged. He now believes that there is no job that he could potentially find, and he stops looking for a job. So when that Bureau of Labor Statistics survey comes to John, it asks him now, do you have a job? He answers no. And then it asks him, are you looking for a job? Now he answers no. Now for the past year, he's been surveyed every month, and every previous survey, he's responded, no, I don't have a job, but yes, I am looking for a job. So what suddenly changed here is that John gave up. He became discouraged and he stopped looking for a job. So John went from being unemployed last year to being no longer a labor force participant, not participating in the labor force in this month of this year. So our labor force has contracted as John gave up looking for a job. Our labor force participation rate has fallen. Also, because previously John was part of that unemployed population. Now he's not. Now he was also part of that labor force. Now he's not. But dividing a smaller unemployed by a smaller labor force, subtract one from each, will still give us a smaller unemployment rate. So when John gives up looking for a job, because he believes it's hopeless, there's no job for him out there, our unemployment rate falls. That's not what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is trying to calculate. That's not what our unemployment rate is intended to measure. Whether or not John believes he can or cannot ever find a job. Ideally, as long as he wants a job, whether or not he believes he can ever find one, we would like to consider him to be unemployed. But the question doesn't quite ask that, so it doesn't quite get that information from him. Now, next, in our third case, suppose we look at Sam, another hypothetical individual. Suppose Sam is the sole earner for his family, and he lost a job, just like John lost a job and Sue lost a job, in which he previously earned $80,000 a year as a research scientist. Now, suppose because he needs to feed his family, there's no other income earner in that family, he immediately takes another job. But the new job that he takes is working for McDonald's, and it pays much less than his original job as a research scientist does. He might continue to look for another better job while he's working for McDonald's. But for the time being, he has a job. That job is not as good as his previous job. So what happens when Sam also receives this monthly survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics? Well, what does it ask him? It asks him, do you have a job? And he answers yes, just like he did last month and the month before that and the month before that. it doesn't ask him which job he has, or how happy he is with his job, whether his job utilizes the skills that he has, or whether his job pays him well. It just asks him whether or not he has a job, and his employment status hasn't changed. Before he was employed, he is still employed. He was in the labor force, he is still in the labor force. So here, there's no change in the unemployment rate because he does not become unemployed. Or at least he might have been unemployed for a couple of days and then he jumped back in, found a new job immediately. And the labor force participation rate doesn't change because he's still participating in the labor force. Now, for Sam, this is a negative labor market outcome. This is a bad thing for Sam and his family. His job is not as good as it was before. We would classify Sam, who has the skills and training to be a highly paid research scientist, but is only able currently to find a job working for McDonald's, where he's paid a very low wage because his skills are not needed. We would consider him to be underemployed. He's not discouraged like John. He's underemployed. And our unemployment rate calculation that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses can't capture any of that information about whether he's underemployed or not. So we miss the fact that this labor market outcome for him is negative. So then what does the unemployment rate really measure? It's missing some important indicators of the strength of the labor market, or whether labor market outcomes are relatively good or relatively bad for workers this year compared to last year. Because it does exclude discouraged workers like John. And once a worker becomes discouraged, we actually see that our unemployment rate falls. It doesn't distinguish between people who work full-time or part-time. It doesn't distinguish between workers who are able to use their skills and training or those who are not, workers who are paid a high wage or workers who are paid a low wage. And we may also find that there are inconsistencies in how people report their employment status for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, depending on certain kinds of self-employed and informal work. Particularly, people who are self-employed could decide to say that's a job, and they have a job. And if the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't ask them whether they're working for themselves, it wouldn't distinguish. But that same person may think of this because they're working for themselves as not having a job. And if that other person reports the same real status as not having a job, we wouldn't know how likely people ultimately were to report self-employment as having a job, or how we could correct for any kind of misreporting, how we could correct for any kind of bias in our data. Although we have these flaws in calculation of the unemployment rate, it's still a good thing that the unemployment rate is easy and simple to calculate, and it's certainly a good thing that it's calculated in a consistent way over time. And because of that, within a country, such as the United States, it's still a very useful measure for how labor market outcomes change over time. If we see that the unemployment rate is 7.3% in 2013, and then falls to 3.5% today, clearly the labor market is stronger, demand for labor is stronger, labor market outcomes must be better than they were in 2013. What's difficult to do, unfortunately, is to make comparisons between countries using this unemployment rate calculation. Because while those things that lead certain workers to be discouraged, to say that they're not looking for work as opposed to looking for work, or to misreport their status, or changes in employment outcomes due to underemployment, while they may be relatively stable over time in one country, they're not at all consistent between countries. So Germany might have very different patterns of reporting or underreporting, reporting underemployment than the United States does. Or Germany may have very different patterns of reporting discouraged worker status, that's not looking for work anymore, than the United States does. As a result, it's difficult for us to compare the unemployment rate in Germany to the unemployment rate in the United States and make any real comparison about which labor market is stronger or where labor market outcomes are better for workers. Now we want to start to talk about where unemployment comes from, why it is that some workers are unemployed, why it is that an unemployment rate may be higher or lower. The first thing we want to do for that is to categorize unemployment based on how long people are unemployed. Talk about their duration of unemployment. First, to point out, most people who lose their jobs and become unemployed are unemployed for a relatively short period of time. They're temporarily unemployed, maybe for only a few months, and then they find another job. So most people who become unemployed have a short duration of unemployment. But at any given point in time, most of the people who are unemployed have been unemployed for a long time. That is to say, those are a relatively small portion of all of the people who lose their jobs, but because they don't find jobs easily, they remain unemployed. And they continue to be part of that unemployment rate month after month and year after year. Most observed unemployment at any given point in time is among those who are long-term unemployed. So we would focus differently on what determines unemployment for those who are unemployed for a short time versus what determines unemployment for those who are unemployed for a long time, and what kind of policies government might introduce to try to reduce unemployment for one group might be quite different from the policies that would be needed to reduce unemployment for the second group. We would also categorize unemployment, not unemployment for a particular individual, but employment rates and unemployment rates as being either cyclical or natural. You'd say that the economy should have a natural rate of unemployment, which is a typical average rate of unemployment, when the economy is neither growing more rapidly or less rapidly than average. So if the United States economy on average grows 2% a year, the natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment we would expect when the economy is growing at 2% a year. Now, different countries have different natural rates of unemployment that we can observe by looking at labor statistics over long periods of time. We can talk later about what the reasons for those differences in natural rates of unemployment might be. Cyclical unemployment, then, is how we describe these deviations or fluctuations from that natural rate. Suppose in the United States, where we have an average long-term growth rate in the economy of 2%, we also have an average unemployment rate of maybe 6%. And if the economy is growing at roughly the normal rate, then unemployment will have roughly the normal rate of approximately 6%. And if right now it's 7.3%, then the gap between 7.3 and 6% is cyclical. It's a positive cyclical unemployment, as there are more people who are unemployed right now than there would normally be. Also, if our unemployment rate is currently 3.5%, but the normal rate, the typical rate of unemployment is 6%, then we would have a negative 2.5% cyclical unemployment, indicating that in the long run, some people who currently have jobs might lose them and become unemployed. How we can see from this graph, looking at estimates for the natural rate of unemployment versus the cyclical rate of unemployment in the United States, is of course that cyclical unemployment, real unemployment, cyclical unemployment jumps up during recessions and jumps down in periods of strong economic growth. Now, the real unemployment rate is volatile because the cyclical rate of unemployment can change a lot. Note, however, that although we talked about the natural rate of unemployment as being a long-run average, it also isn't constant. Because it's an average, but it's a moving average. Because we think that there are certain things in the economy that might change, that might determine, in part, that natural rate of unemployment. Things like minimum wage laws, which we mentioned earlier, could result in some additional unemployment. Things like sectoral shifts in the economy or regional shifts in the economy could lead relatively more people to become unemployed as certain regions where they live decline economically. Unionization can also potentially lead to increases in the natural rate of unemployment, as can changes in government benefits to those who are unemployed. So the natural rate of unemployment in the United States and elsewhere isn't constant over time either, but of course it's much less volatile than the true rate of unemployment at any given point in time. I'll explain why it is that we sometimes have unemployment. We mentioned that this cyclical rate of unemployment tends to go along with relatively high or relatively low growth. It's tied to the business cycle. We haven't really discussed this business cycle here. We may do so later, but the business cycle roughly responds to the cycle in economic growth, sometimes higher than normal, sometimes lower than normal. And that cyclical rate of unemployment goes along with relatively high growth or relatively low growth. Unemployment comes with relatively low growth and then rebounds as the economy does, as the economic growth rebounds. Now, the natural rate of unemployment has determinants as well that aren't due to economic fluctuations, like the business cycle, like cyclical unemployment, but due to simply the way the labor market functions. Now, we can describe different people, different types of unemployment within that natural rate as being either frictional or structural. So unemployment which is frictional comes about when workers lose one job and find another job, but need some amount of time to look for that job and to find a best match for them. Now, these people are only frictionally unemployed because jobs do exist for them to find. It just takes some time for them to find them. We say that a worker is structurally unemployed when no job exists for that worker, or when, for steel workers, for example, with special training useful only in the steel industry, there just aren't as many jobs for steel workers structurally as there are steel workers who would like those jobs, who have the skills that are necessary for those jobs. Some steel mills close, no new steel mills open, and it results in structural unemployment for steel workers and for people in steel communities. Now, structural unemployment tends to be stable over time, to last a long time, and to be an important driver of these long-term unemployed. Long-term unemployed individuals may be structurally unemployed. Something about the structure of the economy has changed such that no job exists for them to find. Those people who are unemployed only for a short period of time are more likely to be what we would call frictionally unemployed, or part of overall frictional unemployment in our economy. What we want to talk about is policies that address frictional unemployment versus policies that address structural unemployment, and how we could, through a policy mechanism, attempt to solve both problems and reduce the natural rate of unemployment. The important thing to bear in mind when we talk about frictional unemployment is that frictional unemployment comes about through job search, through the process of a worker who has lost a job searching for another job, which they will ultimately find. It does exist, and it is a good match for that worker. Now, job search can take time, and job search can also result in relatively better or relatively worse matches for those workers' skills. So when a worker engages in job search, we have a trade-off. That worker could spend a relatively longer time looking for a job and find a better match for their skills, therefore a higher wage, and therefore an increase in efficiency for our whole economy, because that worker is more productive in that better fitting job, better matching job. Therefore, they deserve a higher wage in that better matching job. Or that worker could spend relatively less time on job search and take a job that was a less good match, the first job that became available to them. If they take that job, which isn't as good of a match, their wage is lower and their productivity is lower. It's not as good for that worker. It may also not be as good for the economy as a whole, result in less efficiency and less productivity. But that worker is producing as opposed to being unemployed and not producing at that time. Again, here there's a trade-off. Well, sectoral shifts, in some circumstances, could result in frictional unemployment. If we have a sectoral shift such that one sector of the economy shrinks and another sector of the economy grows, we'll have some workers whose skills were relevant in the shrinking sector, but whose skills are also relevant in growing sectors. For those workers, they will become frictionally unemployed. Now, other workers will find that in the shrinking sector, their skills were very useful, but in the growing sector, their skills are not. Those workers will be likely to become structurally rather than frictionally unemployed due to these sectoral shifts in the economy. Around the world, many public policies to address the problem of unemployment. And of course, unemployment is a problem. We said unemployment causes people in the economy, the whole economy, to not utilize some available resources. It causes the economy to produce inside the PPF less total output than the economy could potentially be producing. If we could bring those unemployed workers back into employment, total output would increase, our economy would grow. But it's not just bad for those workers that those workers are unemployed. It's bad for society and the economy as a whole that those workers are unemployed. Some of these public policies that governments can use to address the problem of unemployment specifically attempt to address job search, to focus on job search. One of those is through a government employment agency. These are particularly common in Europe, where government employment agencies gather information about jobs, they gather information about unemployed workers, and they attempt to facilitate matches by spreading this information. They spread information about workers to businesses looking to hire. They spread information about available jobs to workers who are looking for work, looking for jobs. They attempt to speed up how quickly workers are able to find new jobs after some sectoral shift has caused them to become frictionally unemployed. Governments also attempt to address this job search problem through public training programs. Now, public training programs aren't intended to address so much frictional unemployment, because workers who are frictionally unemployed, we said, have skills which are relevant for sectors that are growing, and they're likely to be able to find good jobs eventually. It's more intended to address those workers that we would classify as being structurally unemployed, therefore unemployed for long periods of time. And they could take some of that long time in which they're unemployed to get new education and learn new skills, skills that weren't necessary for their previous jobs in declining sectors, but might be necessary for new jobs in growing sectors. For example, someone who's laid off from a steel mill and has skills useful for steel production may not have skills which are necessary for software production, but that sector of the economy might be what's growing. So these public training programs might attempt to provide these unemployed steel workers with education in coding or education in web design to make those workers have skills which are useful and marketable in growing sectors so that they will be able to find a better match for their skills and be able to find better jobs over time and become employed rather than structurally unemployed. The next type of government policy that we often see in order to address the problems of unemployment doesn't directly try to make people employed, but rather to make their experience of unemployment more palatable. This is unemployment insurance. Many countries around the world, including Turkey, have unemployment insurance mechanisms, and the way that it works is that people have to pay in, or their employer needs to pay into an insurance pool as long as they have a job. But then when someone loses a job, they receive monthly payments for some period of time from an unemployment insurance pool. These are often a little bit less than the wages that they would have been paid if they still had a job. Now, so long as they continue to look for work, generally speaking, so they're considered to be unemployed rather than considered to be not participating in the labor market, they receive payments from this unemployment insurance pool. If they stop looking for work, then they stop receiving money from the unemployment insurance scheme. So obviously, workers are likely to at least report to the Bureau of Labor Statistics or whoever else is gathering this data that because they're receiving unemployment insurance, they're certainly looking for work, and they may need to prove to some government entity to prove to them that they are continuing to look for work as well. For example, by attending job interviews, sending out job applications, etc. Also, tends to be the case that unemployment insurance schemes give temporary payments. They may receive 6 months worth of unemployment insurance payments, or 1 year or 2 years, but it's not going to be forever, because we know that people respond to incentives. If we give them an incentive to remain unemployed, all else equal, it may cause some people to prefer to be unemployed and looking for work rather than employed and actually working, depending on the jobs that they might get, the wages that they would receive, how they feel about those jobs, etc. It's better for the economy if they get a job, but it may not always be better for that individual to get a job rather than continue to receive unemployment insurance payments. Now, economy-wide, of course, the main benefit of unemployment insurance is that it's better for workers than if they simply have no income. They'll be less likely to lose their homes, they'll be less likely to be unable to feed their families as a result of something that happened to them in the labor market, etc. That's the main purpose. But for the entirety of the economy, we also like that unemployment insurance reduces uncertainty over incomes, so it allows people to make better decisions about saving and investment and have less worry. And we also think that unemployment insurance, because it allows people to spend more time looking for jobs, they're not desperate to find the first job available so that they can pay their rent or get the first job available to buy food for their children. They may look for a job for a longer time and find, as we mentioned, a better match through job search when they do that. If they find a better match, it's not just better for them, they're more productive. Therefore, they earn a higher wage. And if they're more productive, then our overall economic output is greater as well. Some policies that we institute also can have an effect of creating some structural unemployment, even though obviously the point of these policies isn't to create structural unemployment. As mentioned, those policies such as unemployment insurance payments, they can actually increase structural employment because they cause people to take a longer time looking for work. They increase the time on job search, but that may or may not be undesirable. We're not sure. Now, minimum wage laws, as we mentioned, create a structural, permanent gap in whatever labor markets that they affect, provided that it is a binding minimum wage. They create a permanent gap between the quantity of labor that is supplied, that is, the number of people who are looking for jobs, and the quantity of labor demanded, the number of jobs that are available for them to find. Now, we called that in a previous lecture a labor market surplus. Labor market surplus is the same thing as unemployment, because all of those workers in that surplus, the gap between quantity of labor supplied and quantity of labor demanded, all of those workers would report that they are looking for jobs but do not have them. So high minimum wages can create unemployment, and they create unemployment that is structural because these workers will not be able to find jobs over time. There simply aren't enough of them to go around. We can have this structural unemployment that results from a labor market surplus, whenever quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, even when that wage is not too high because of a minimum wage law. We could also have a wage that was above the equilibrium wage due to the strength of unions in that industry. As for example, the strength of unions in steelworking in the United States, or the strength of unions in automobile manufacturing in the United States. In those industries, wages may be very high relative to what the equilibrium wage would be. No, it's not set by the government. It's not determined as a minimum wage. Still, through collective bargaining with the union, businesses are not able to pay a wage which is lower. And because they're not able to pay a wage which is lower, they're not willing to hire as many workers as they otherwise would have been willing to hire. But because wages in those industries are so high, because union workers have negotiated high wages, many people would like those jobs. So the quantity of labor supplied in steelworking or the quantity of labor supplied in automobile manufacturing is higher than it otherwise would be. And that also leads to unemployment. Many people are looking for these great union jobs, but they can't find them. There just aren't enough of those jobs to go around. And because they say that they're looking for jobs when they're given this survey by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but they don't have jobs, they're classified as unemployed. Economists, when they model the effects of unions, chiefly unions, especially public sector unions as well, which in modern economies make up an increasing share of overall public sector workers, government workers. We say when unions raise the wage for their employees, the members of the union, above what the market equilibrium would have been, that benefits certain people that are classified as insiders. They also create a class of outsiders, people who are not union members, who are not able to get these higher wages and actually not able to find jobs at all. Now, if some industries or some professions are unionized, and in those professions there are fewer people hired with higher wages than we would otherwise have in our economy, those people are altogether, with those jobs, insiders. And people who are not able to find jobs in those professions, but perhaps able to find jobs in other professions that are not unionized, are all outsiders. Say, if large sectors of the economy are unionized, creating a large insider group, the outsider group will actually in some cases be worse off. Because there are more people, because they can't find jobs in these insider professions, there are more people looking for those jobs in outsider professions than there otherwise would have been. Increase in the labor supply in those professions means a lower equilibrium wage. Now, as far as whether unions in general are good or bad, of course, they do benefit insiders. They do benefit their members. They do give them higher wages. And if we want higher wages for workers in certain industries, not for efficiency purposes, but for fairness and equity purposes, then we might say that unions are a good thing on balance for this reason. It might lead to some transfer of income from factory owners to factory workers. If that's a desirable goal, we might like unions and argue that unions are a good thing. We might also argue that large firms, such as, say, coal mining firms, may have market power in the labor market. They may be something like a monopsony, or more like an oligopoly in the labor market, and that the labor market outcomes would not normally, in the absence of unions, be fair. They might pay less and hire fewer workers than a competitive labor market would see. In that case, we might also argue that unions in these industries might be necessary in order to have market power on the supply side, alleviate the effects of market power on the demand side, and have a negotiated wage which might be closer to the true equilibrium wage if those firms didn't have monopsony power to begin with. Now, of course, many other economists agree that unions are a bad thing for the economy overall, that unions act as cartels, driving wages up above what they otherwise would have been, causing unemployment, and causing the economy to shrink because fewer people are employed. Now, the next thing we want to look at isn't a public policy at all, but it's another reason that wages could be higher than the equilibrium wage. And this is the idea of an efficiency wage. Now, in the theory of efficiency wages, workers might pay their workers a low wage or a high wage and consider carefully whether their workers would work harder or not, or whether they would be able to attract better workers or worse. The theory goes that, although there are several different versions of efficiency wage theory, the theory goes that if a business decides to pay a higher wage than the equilibrium wage, assuming that's what all other employers pay, they'll first attract the best workers, And their workers will work harder. If workers can control their own effort, their workers will work harder because they won't want to lose this great job that pays a high wage, because if they do, they'll need to find a job with some other company that pays a lower wage. So this idea would be that the firm might have a reason to choose to pay a higher wage than the market equilibrium wage, because if they paid the market equilibrium wage, their workers wouldn't work as hard, and their workers wouldn't be as high quality. So if just one business chooses to pay a wage that's high and all others don't, that business may find that to be optimal. That their productivity is increased, their output is increased, their efficiency is increased, and they get higher profits paying higher wages. As we talked about in those game theoretical oligopoly scenarios, if we imagine that all of the businesses in this industry are equal, they're all the same, they all face the same opportunities, they might all see that if they each paid an efficiency wage, a higher wage, they would each get higher productivity, and they would each be better off. So they would each have the dominant strategy to pay a higher wage. And we would see an outcome for all of them that they all choose to pay a higher wage. And when they all choose to pay a higher wage, these aren't efficiency wages anymore really at all. They're not creating any additional efficiency, because each worker that might lose a job would tend to see that they could find another job with another company also paying a higher wage. So as a result, productivity isn't quite as high. They're not able to attract the best workers when all of these workers are paying higher wages. But we do see that when all of these businesses are paying higher wages to their workers, this creates some unemployment. That is, there are more workers looking for those jobs than there otherwise would have been. And because all of these businesses are paying higher wages without really having very much additional productivity, they might all hire fewer workers than they would otherwise have been willing to hire. And this extra unemployment does increase the risk of losing a job. So workers in these industries, where every business is paying a higher wage than the equilibrium wage, they do have some incentive to try to work harder and hold on to that job. We would also see that for any single business, if we have 10 businesses in that industry, and 9 of them pay a higher wage, and one of them decides that it just isn't worth it because productivity isn't very high, that one business would be the only one paying a low wage. They would get the least productivity from their workers. Their workers would be the worst. All of the better workers, higher quality workers, they would all choose to work for other firms. And also, workers of that firm wouldn't be worrying very much at all about losing this job, because if they were able to find a job with one of those other better paying firms, they would get more. They would all be seeking to leave the firm. So there would be an incentive for every firm, even though they're not getting real productivity gains, to maintain that higher wage, because if any one were to lower their wage, that one would have very low productivity, much lower productivity than if all of these businesses paid a low wage. That theory of efficiency wages suggests there may be an internal logic in the industry for all of those businesses to pay a wage that's, in essence, too high, higher than the market equilibrium wage would have been. And because of that, not getting very much, but only slight productivity gains at the market level, not be willing to hire as many workers. We'd also see more workers looking for those jobs than there otherwise would have been, creating unemployment. And that unemployment would also be enduring over time, just like unemployment that arises because of minimum wages or unemployment that arises due to unions.